Good evening. My name is Paul Revel, and I'd like to welcome you to the Askwith Forum. We're delighted to have you here. Some of you may have noticed we had an election a couple of days ago. So we hastily put together a highly qualified panel to help us have a conversation about that election and about its implications for education. So I'm very much looking forward to our conversation this evening. Most of you will know that the purpose of the Askwith Forums is to share new knowledge, to generate spirited conversation, and to offer insight into the highest priority challenges for the future of public education. It's an important way that the Harvard Graduate School of Education plays a part in the civic discourse on public education that's so important to moving our education agenda forward. I'm delighted that we have a distinguished panel to be with us this evening. I'm going to briefly, in a moment, introduce the panelists to you, and then we're going to carry on a spirited conversation on stage here for about 45 minutes, discussing a range of the issues at a top level, and then we're going to open up the floor, and when that time comes, we'll ask each of you to approach the microphone and identify yourself and raise a question for us. But we're joined this evening on the panel by Celine Coggins, who is the CEO of Teach Plus, which she founded in 2008 to retain experienced teachers in urban classrooms. Teach Plus has since expanded to 6 cities, training almost 500 teachers and mobilizing a network of 10,000 teachers nationwide. She began her career as a middle school teacher in Worcester, Massachusetts. She's the former policy director and a colleague of mine at the Rennie Center for Education Research and Policy, and Celine received her PhD in education policy from Stanford University. To her right is a well-known figure in the Harvard Graduate School of Education, Joe Almeida, who's an assistant professor here. His primary research interests are in creating high-quality schooling at scale and the professionalization of teaching. He's co-editor of the recently released The Futures of Education Reform and author of the forthcoming The Allure of Order, High Hopes, Dashed Expectations, and the Troubled Quest to Remake American Schooling. He's currently working on 2 projects, The Chastened Dreamed, a history of the effort to link social science with social policy to achieve social progress, and In Search of Deeper Learning, a contemporary study of schools, systems, and nations that are seeking to produce ambitious instruction. Joel received his PhD in sociology and social policy from Harvard University. And finally, to Joel's right, Marty West, who's an assistant professor of education at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. He's deputy director of the program on education policy and governance at the Harvard Kennedy School. He's executive editor of Education Next, a journal of opinion and research on education policy. Marty served as the chair of Governor Romney's advisory group for K-12 education policy in the 2012 presidential election. He received his PhD in government and social policy from Harvard University. So that's our panel. We're delighted to have you as an audience with us, and we're going to get started. So I'm going to move over and have a seat and raise my first question, which is, we've just been through a lengthy, expensive campaign for the office of the presidency. If you were the average citizen in the street, you would have been forgiven if you admitted that this topic of education seldom came up in the course of the discourse during this campaign. Occasional mentions here and there, but not a prominent issue, notwithstanding the fact that education continues in most polls to be conducted to be very important to citizens and voters all across the country. So I want to ask our panelists, by way of beginning, and maybe we'll start with you, Celine, at that end of the panel and work this way, ask you why you think that was the case.
Well, on the one hand, I'd say I think that part of the reason is that many of the key issues that you all are probably talking about at Harvard, that have been key issues that states and districts and the federal government have advanced over the past 4 years, are issues that are essentially one step removed from the experience of the average voter who might be a parent of a child in school. So for example, if an issue like class size is something that can really kind of resonate with a voter because they can see how it would directly impact themselves and their student. On the other hand, some of the issues that we've been dealing with, like teacher evaluation, like turning around schools, like the use of data and data warehouses, are things that take a few steps of explanation for the average voter or the average parent to even track with in terms of how does that impact them and how does that impact the child they're raising. On the other hand, I talked with a colleague at the Winston Group who does polling and across the array of issues that have to do with voters. And what she told me was that over the course of time, from the year 2000 when education was rated as a top issue to 2004 and 2008 where it dropped significantly, it's on the rise in terms of voter interest.
Thank you. Joe.
I agree with Celine that it is a hard issue to talk about for the candidates. On the Democratic side, the race to the top, investing in education, and waivers on No Child Left Behind are things which the Obama administration thinks are good policy, which have some level of support in the states, but are not easy to explain. On the Republican side, Marty can speak to this with more detail, but the federal role question is just sort of sitting right in the middle, right? So Romney is sort of on the one hand trying to argue he was a very successful educational governor in Massachusetts. On the other hand, he's got a big part of his party that thinks that there should be a very limited federal role in education. So Obama talked about it some, but at a level of really high level of generality. We raised standards nationally, and he did sort of link it as part of his sort of stump speech about part of the future is investing in education and infrastructure and things like that. But he didn't have specific things to point to that he thought he could communicate clearly. And I think Romney was in this sort of double bind.
So I think a lot of the most important points have already been made. I think why the candidates weren't talking about it, though, most fundamentally, it's not what voters were interested in hearing them talk about this year. If you look at polling that was conducted in the course of this election, both internally by the Romney campaign and more nationally, roughly 1% of voters said that education was the most important issue in determining their vote in this election. And to compare it to 2000, more than 20% were giving that answer more than any other issue. So this is a big shift. It wasn't what was on voters' minds. That's despite the fact that, yes, voters do see education as a serious problem. National sort of assessments of the public schools are at an all-time low. But at the same time, voters' assessments of their local schools are at an all-time high. So to the extent that people perceive education as a problem in the U.S., and I think they do, they perceive it as someone else's problem. And then there are opportunities for leadership, certainly. A candidate can bring voters along, tell them they should care about this. But here, I think Jal hit on it. It's actually a difficult difficult issue, rather, for candidates in either party to talk about at the moment. President Obama, a lot of his main accomplishments are actually sort of involve positions that draw a lot of criticism from the teachers' unions that are an important component of the Democratic base. And conversely, it's always hard for a Republican to talk about federal leadership in education, given the views within the party on that issue. So I think you're left with a fairly superficial, very general exchange on the issue. Sometimes it devolves into sort of superficial attacks. So President Obama and affiliated PACs going after Romney for saying that class size isn't important when Arne Duncan has been saying the same thing for 4 years, saying that he's threatening dramatic cuts in education spending when federal education spending is obviously a small part of the overall picture. And then you have Romney characterizing Obama as some sort of union lackey, which is just not consistent with the way his administration has conducted itself over the past 4 years. So I think that's where we are.
Okay, so that's where we come from in terms of the campaign. So let's change gears and talk about where we're going. Probably the most discussed issue, and again, here I think part of the answer to this last question is ambiguity about what the federal role really is for the average voter in the street. But if you talk to people who are talking about education policy in Washington, D.C., the number one topic is the reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, No Child Left Behind. So most of the reading of tea leaves over the past couple of days has had to do with where are we going on that. Marty, any sense from you as to what this means for reauthorization?
I think we should all remember to be very skeptical about our ability to predict much that happens going forward. I think not many of us would have been able to anticipate where we are today 4 years ago. But the one thing that I was struck with over the course of the campaign is that I had the chance to meet with a number of members of Congress and staffers of members of Congress from both parties. And I was really struck by the degree to which the members of both parties were really upset by the waiver process as sort of a way that the administration had circumvented Congress's authority. And so I think that's going to be an important dynamic going forward. I don't know how it's going to play out entirely, but we often think about what happens in Washington as being solely a function of conflict between the two parties, Democrats and Republicans. I think this executive branch versus legislative branch tension is going to be really important. And so it might be important enough that it allows members of Congress to come together across the parties and put forward a bill that would be able to win support. Of course,
Marty, could you, just in case we have any lay members of the audience who don't understand the waiver issue, could you just take one quick minute to explain what waivers are, and we can talk a little bit about what the intent in having waivers was about?
Yeah, so No Child Left Behind was scheduled for reauthorization first in 2007, 5 years after it was initially passed. Obviously, a lot of time has passed since then, and there are many components of the law that have become problematic over time, such as the goal of 100% proficiency by 2014, for example, which is now just around the corner. Congress has not been able to pass a reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. And as a result, the Secretary of Education, Arne Duncan, has taken advantage of his authority granted in the law to grant waivers to the states. And so he's waived certain aspects of the No Child Left Behind accountability system. In addition to simply waiving parts of the law, he's required as a condition of receiving those waivers that states adopt a number of policies that his administration has been trying to promote, such as teacher evaluation based on objective indicators of student achievement, measures along those lines. And so I think in particular, this attachment of additional conditions that Congress has not promulgated itself is what has members of Congress worked up.
Okay, so that's the source of the controversy, not so much the waivers themselves, but the conditions that are imposed on getting a waiver.
I think it's a little bit of both, but in particular that.
All right. Joel?
So yeah, just to pick right up where Marty left off. So from the point of view of Congress, they're being essentially sort of cut out of this process, which is now running from the executive branch through to the states. The word waiver is sort of a misnomer because you have to meet a series of requirements that Marty just outlined in order to get this. So sort of one possibility, I talked to, I'm a professor here, so I talked to a few folks in Washington yesterday to try to find out like what people there thought was going on in preparation for the panel. And, so the sort of the most optimistic read I got was Congress feels left out of the loop. Senator Harkin, Iowa was turned down for a waiver, and Senator Harkin is the Democratic lead on education, and that will essentially sort of prompt more congressional action, so as to sort of basically kind of deal themselves back into the game. The argument on the other side was, it's been 6 years, 5 going on 6 years since it was supposed to be reauthorized. This was basically a status quo election in terms of nothing changing on the Republican, Democratic, or presidential side. And so there's no sort of really strong reason, as you said in your opening, no one made this a sort of campaign priority and no one's promised this to the voters. And thus for all those reasons, there's sort of no immediate reason to think that would happen. The one argument as to how it could happen is that because of the waivers, states are sort of moving towards getting their systems ready for career and college-ready standards. So it's possible that similar to the way that No Child Left Behind built on a state standards movement in the 90s, that an ESEA reauthorization could essentially build on some of the work that states are already doing under the waiver process, because what they're being asked to do to get the waivers is fairly similar. So that states might say, we want to go forward and continue with this.
Waivers aside, Celine, I mean, as you address this, I'm curious whether you think there's a sufficient patch of common ground between the two parties about reauthorization that would enable anybody to have optimism that something's going to happen here? Because many have argued that's why we haven't gotten reauthorization to date, is there wasn't enough to agree on. Where do you think we are?
Yeah, so, there was some movement in the House over the past half year where the ranking member, Klein, had introduced a reauthorization package for ESEA. In the Senate, that's kind of where some of the problems lie, and as Lamar Alexander comes to replace Enzi, there seems to be kind of greater disagreement between Harkin, who is the ranking member, and Alexander on the Republican side. And so I think that actually is going to create a lesser likelihood that it would pass the Senate. And so that seems to be kind of where the problem lies, as best I can understand it.
Let me tackle a particular issue here and start with you, Celine, since this is where you live with teachers. We've spent a large measure the past couple of years in very engaged, spirited discourse and eventually policy making in many of our states around the whole topic of teacher evaluation. To the degree it was mentioned in the campaign, and it did come up from time to time, what do you think the implications are now of this election for what's going to happen in the domain of teacher evaluation? Where is that headed now?
Yeah, I think, so what happened over the course of the past 4 years was kind of a lot of the vanguard movement on that topic area. So this goes back to what happened to get Obama elected in 2008, which was actually pretty profound in altering the contours of how Democrats get elected to office. So for the first time, Obama got elected, even though making it through the primary, both of the teachers' unions were heavily in support of Hillary Clinton. And so the fact that Obama got elected without the popular support of the union and made it that far actually changed what he was able to do. He was less beholden to the union than any other Democratic president before him. And so what ended up happening were a lot of the policies that he advanced under Race to the Top, under the Teacher Incentive Fund, under I3, the Innovation Fund, are things that looked very different than what would have happened under, say, a Clinton administration. And so one of the things that has really kind of moved and changed over the course of the past 4 years has been that in many places now, there are teachers who are, where states have passed legislation that say teachers must be evaluated annually and must be evaluated with some sort of student test data associated in their evaluation. So at this stage, most places have kind of completed the legislative change and are in the process of implementation. And so the question becomes a question of political will, and the question becomes an implementation question rather than a real policy change. We're seeing in places like DC and Memphis, where we work, a ton of energy and a ton of effort, and also a ton of spending going into making these systems work. Organizations like the Gates Foundation have placed multi-million-dollar bets on this as being something that kind of moves the profession forward, and are continuing that investment. But there are plenty of places around the country, like in California, for example, that are much further behind, haven't been granted a waiver, are not on board with the idea of tying a teacher's performance to what their students are doing in the classroom. And so so I think we're challenged by the fact that there are plenty of states that have moved ahead, and the issue is kind of just sustaining the political will, and the fact that many reformers see this issue as having been won, and in places as significant as California, it hasn't quite moved that way yet.
Joel and Marty, in the teacher domain, not just on the evaluation issue, but we heard class size come up, as has been discussed in the campaign. Numbers of teachers, STEM teachers is another topic that came up at various points during the campaign. What do you see happening, if anything, as a result of the election in the teacher domain?
Well, it's not easy necessarily to sort of read the tea leaves. Like, there has been some attention to all the various state initiatives, referendums, where voters could sort of essentially weigh in on a number of these issues. And one and the number of these things is relatively small, so it's hard to know like whether there's a trend. So like, for example, South Dakota and Idaho both rejected laws that would have instituted essentially merit pay on the basis of test scores. And Tony Bennett, the sort of reform chief in Indiana, got voted down. So you could read things like that as saying that some portion of the public or the public, the public that votes. I'm not positing that this is a representative cross-section of the public as a whole, but folks who show up at elections are, raising some questions about sort of certain parts of the, particularly the sort of teacher evaluation part of the agenda. But then at the same time, in Georgia and Washington State, there was support for measures that would have expanded charter schooling in those states. Now, people tend to talk as if there's sort of reformers and all of their linked issues sort of go under one tent, and then there are people who are opposed to those things. I think actually on the merits that we've sort of overinvested in teacher evaluation, but I think also on the merits that having charter schools and regulating them appropriately is also a good idea. So one might begin to argue that we're starting to sort of parse this agenda and starting to think about sort of which parts of these things seem like a good idea and which parts less so.
Okay, fair enough. Marty?
So you mentioned specifically STEM teachers, where President Obama, when he did talk about education, would talk about $1 billion to provide a number of additional teachers in these subjects. I don't think anything's going to happen on that front just because there's not the money to do it, frankly. And that goes the same for President Obama's proposal for $8 billion for community colleges that, again, there was no money for in the first place and no effort made to really explain where that's coming from. So I think as I think about the teacher issue going forward, I think a lot depends on what we were just talking about, the ESEA reauthorization process. This is one of the big issues in whether there's going to be able to be a compromise between the House and the Senate that the administration could go along with. Representative Klein, the Republican chairman in the House, has actually, despite concerns about the federal role, because of his support for policies like merit pay evaluations based on achievement, is willing to fold that in as a requirement under ESEA, just as it is in the waivers. Senator Alexander is not at all willing to go in that direction, at least coming into the conversation. And so I think we're going to see an interesting sort of debate there between two Republicans.
And also about 6 months ago, Arne Duncan gave a big speech and announced what they're calling the Respect Initiative, which is ideally a $5 billion program aimed at building the teaching profession. Kind of the pillar of that is evaluations that can distinguish among the performance of teachers. And then going from there, it's paying teachers differently. It's creating more leadership opportunities for teachers, the types of things that will keep great teachers in the classroom. But as of now, I believe that's just an idea that has been publicly launched and has basically no plan for moving forward.
Let me, the issue of funding has been introduced, and that's an important one. I know where I live on Beacon Hill, that's the first thing that get talked about after the election is what are the economic impacts of this? We're still coming out of the worst recession since the Great Depression, and we're looking at a budget deficit even as we look at this year's budget going forward. People are concerned about economic implications, so I guess I'm pushing you to think a little bit about the larger economic picture. And Marty, you commented, there isn't enough money around to do some of these great ideas that have been introduced as possibilities. Where do you think we're going on matters like sequestration and the federal budget generally, particularly as it applies to education and the federal role?
Well, I'm not sure I called them great ideas.
Okay. All right. We'll put that in quotation marks.
But as you say, they're not talking in Washington, D.C. now about finding new ways to spend money. They're talking about how we're going to deal with the fiscal cliff looming at the end of the calendar year.
So what should we be getting ready for?
Well, as I look at it, there are really two stories of the past 4 years when it comes to education spending. One is what's on budget and what's off budget. So President Obama invested billions of dollars in education if we include the stimulus spending, which was obviously a deviation from the normal budget process. If you look at the regular budget process, education spending actually grew much more slowly under the Obama administration than under the Bush administration, the Clinton administration, or the Bush administration previous to that. And I think that gives you a sense of what the budget dynamic is right now, which is that it's very hard to find new money for education in Washington, given the rising cost of entitlements. And so I think we're going to be figuring out how to sort of allocate money within a relatively tight education budget. And the big question is how much is going to go into formulas like Title I and special ed, and how much is going to be put into competitive grant programs like Race to the Top. And so you have a funny situation right now where actually Republicans are really interested in maintaining formula funding and are actually providing higher estimates, or proposals for appropriations in that area than is the administration, which is quite a reversal of the party's positions on these issues.
I'm interested in your thoughts on those, but what's also in the midst of this going to happen to major administration initiatives like Race to the Top, the I-3 grants? What do you speculate, Joel and Celine, about that?
I think one of the questions is if we do go off the fiscal cliff and those issues aren't resolved, what is set to get cut are the core issues, the Title I, IDEA, and not some of the monies that are going into the competitive grants like Race to the Top and I-3. And so the question becomes, you know, how are there going to be choices made, and is there a way to make choices to kind of fill back in some of the Title I money that's being lost, and does that take away from the reform agenda then?
One of the interesting questions in the long run ties back to the ESEA discussion, because in the Senate Democrats' proposal around ESEA, the idea is that I-3 and Race to the Top would essentially be sort of built in and become part of regular funding. And Republicans are opposed to that, at least for now. So it'll be interesting to see what happens there. I think with sequestration, it seems unlikely that the Republicans are going to allow for huge cuts in defense, and thus some sort of deal will be worked out.
Or at least a short-term deal.
What's the fate of the Common Core state standards and the assessment consortiums likely to be in coming months or coming years?
I can start on that one, I guess. And I'd be interested to hear Marty's response on what would have happened had Romney been elected, which I think is the more interesting counterfactual. I mean, I think it's going to be continued, and the Obama administration is sort of trying to continue to walk this fine line of taking some credit for leading the effort, but not so much credit that it becomes a sort of federal thing. I think in substantive terms, I'm fearful. Because I think that Common Core is a good idea in principle, that the type of learning that's being promoted within Common Core, we won't know for sure until we really look at the assessments, but seems to be moving towards fewer topics and more depth, which I think would put us more in line with other leading nations and would make a lot of sense. But I sort of fear we're going to make the No Child Left Behind mistake all over again, which is we're going to ask for really ambitious targets, much more ambitious, in fact, than No Child Left Behind. And then quickly it'll become clear. Kentucky already piloted this and discovered that 30% more of their students were not proficient than before under Common Core. And I don't think there's any problem with that. I think that reflects the reality of what students out there actually can do and what teachers can do. But I'm fearful that in a climate where there's no money, high accountability, and really high standards, that what is a good idea will get rolled out. Schools and states won't be able to realize the standards, and that will lead to backlash, sinking what was otherwise a good idea.
So I'd like to jump in on this counterfactual and actually make the case that Tuesday night's outcomes were the worst possible outcomes for the Common Core. And that's despite the fact that Romney did say he didn't want to put any additional funds into federal support for the assessment consortia. In fact, I got in trouble at a debate for, I guess, making it sound close enough to the fact that Romney would claw back the funds that have already been awarded, and this set off great consternation when it looked like perhaps he could win. But on Tuesday night, Joel already alluded to this. Tony Bennett in Indiana, who was a state schools chief with a very strong reputation, and pursued an aggressive reform agenda that really endeared him to the Republican Party pushing the expansion of a voucher or creation of a voucher program, the expansion of the charter sector, teacher evaluations, merit pay. He was defeated unexpectedly despite having considerable resources at his disposal, and he was defeated not just because of Democratic opposition. After all, Romney won the state by 10%. He was defeated because of Tea Party opposition to the fact that he had been one of the Republican state chiefs who was behind the Common Core. And one of the things we learned over the course of the campaign is that this idea that there's resistance to the federal involvement in the Common Core is not a myth, and that there's actually political muscle behind it. And so I'm a supporter of the Common Core. Governor Romney was a supporter of the Common Core as a voluntary state effort. But to the extent that the federal government got involved in it, in incentivizing, perhaps coercing states to participate in it, it politicized it. And so as the Common Core is being rolled out, a very difficult process that Jal described, it's going to be rolled out in red states that are going to see this as being imposed on them by a Democratic Party that's put support for the Common Core in its party platform. And I think, the opportunity the Common Core could provide would be to change the dynamic that I talked about earlier, where people see the problem in American education as someone else's problem, by providing them a better sense of where schools actually stand. And I worry that that opportunity is going to be lost because it's going to be tied up in party politics.
So are you predicting that some states are going to begin to bail on a Common Core? Because it is, after all, voluntary.
I think they may.
Yeah.
And
Celine?
what is so maddening about that, as someone who works with teachers on the ground in Indiana, is, where we are in different states and different districts is very variable. There are plenty of teachers who have been implementing Common Core for more than a year, who are pretty far along in this, who, we just did a conference for 400 teachers in Indiana, where, teacher leaders were talking about what they've been doing over the past couple of years in their classrooms to implement Common Core. And so it's pretty far along in plenty of places, and that actually creates a huge problem because you have really frustrated people on the ground who recognize the political context and can say, I don't even know if this is going to persist in my state. I know there's huge resistance to that. There's no place in the country where that's more clear than Indiana, but it was clear to teachers, even a few months ago. And so it creates a lot of kind of frustration at the school level.
Yeah, I'm actually not sure how many states will opt out, because I think a lot of the decisions have been made. It's not clear that option's on the table right now, and there may continue to be federal incentives to remain participating. I'm more worried about the uncertainty and the way in which the implementation will become more difficult as a result of the
And this is where,
dynamic.
If the second term with respect to education is kind of more of the same, building a legacy based on the big audacious goals that were put out in the first term, you have these big, seismic shifts that happened around evaluation, around the Common Core. And you look at a place like Chicago, where the teachers ended up going on strike because, it's all coming all at once. We're going to, change the way you're evaluated. It's going to take tons of time for you to learn the system and participate in the system. We're going to introduce a whole new set of standards with assessments coming, and just so you get the link, you're going to be evaluated in a higher stakes way based on these new, new standards and new assessments. And we're going to add to your day, and we're not going to pay you more. You reach a breaking point in the teaching profession that is worrisome, given that if the first term was all about the new, big, audacious kind of landmarks, this term is going to need to be about, and how do we stay the course and implement all of those things and sustain the political will.
Let's talk for a moment about higher education. Federal government has taken a larger role in higher education as well. The Obama administration and Arne Duncan have repeatedly expressed interest in tighter links between, for example, community colleges and employers in the country. Marty mentioned proposed greater investment in those community colleges. There's a lot of concern about the ever-escalating cost of public higher education, or higher education generally. The Pell Grants have been on the table for a discussion. There's anxiety about the whole research agenda in higher education, particularly as it affects potential budget cuts. What do you see this election meaning for higher education as you look at the results?
I mean, I'll just offer, one or two things, and then you guys can jump in. I talked to someone in the department yesterday, and seemed like the perspective was regulation in higher ed was still really difficult, especially on the Democratic side. So they were going to push for kind of increased transparency, especially around retention. There are just phenomenally high dropout rates across various types of institutions in higher ed, and it seems like they are going to make that a sort of spotlighted priority. But ultimately, it doesn't sound that different from the sort of longstanding Democratic line. Republicans have been willing to make the sort of stronger, more provocative statements about higher ed and the need to rein in costs. Obama did talk about it a little bit during the campaign, but I would be really surprised if there was really strong follow through on that issue, because the political costs are really high for Democrats, and whether they actually have the leverage to produce the change is unclear.
Yeah, there was an important agreement between the two candidates on this issue of transparency. Both really emphasized the fact that in American higher education, quite the reverse of K-12, we have all the choice in the world, but we have no information with which to inform that choice. And so both of them talked about the need to improve transparency about retention rates, which again is the real problem, much more so than
And
access.
accountability, really.
And debt burdens and tuition, net price, things like that. So I think you'll see the administration continue some stuff that it's tried to do and that it has support for Congress on in that area. I think there were some big differences between the two candidates on higher education, especially with respect to the for-profit sector, where Governor Romney didn't want to see them singled out and regulated differently. The Obama administration sort of did want them singled out and regulated differently. So I think that was a big difference. And also when it comes to student loans, the Obama administration sort of took control of the student loan industry, and Romney was very interested in undoing that. Right. The Republicans in Congress are very interested in undoing that. They just scheduled hearings because they think the government has done a poor job of administering the direct loan program. But I think this was an area where there were some sort of consequences of the election.
And I'll just add one thing briefly. I'm definitely a K-12 teacher quality person, and so one of my questions as I was kind of doing some research for the panel was, so what's going to be the big teacher quality issue? The last 4 years have been a bonanza on teacher quality issues. And what I heard repeatedly was it really is about preparation and getting accountability for teacher preparation programs through higher ed. And so that's one to add to the kind of general accountability theme.
The department official I talked to also said potentially more kind of race to the top type stuff for higher ed. So
with a focus on cost containment. That's been something they've been talking.
One interesting things about the first term of the Obama administration is that in general the federal role has been about sort of setting targets and basically kind of protecting students from bad actors. And in a pretty important way, the Obama administration, through both Race to the Top and I3, have sort of tried to argue there could be a different role. We could not only be trying to sort of regulate people from not doing bad things, we could be trying to sort of build coalitions of the willing who might be interested in doing good things, and then think about how we could spread it. And we could argue about whether they set the parameters for what they were incentivizing in the right way. And so that also sort of opens up a world of possibilities in higher ed where regulation is difficult, but this kind of incentive-based thing may work.
One last point on higher ed is that the projections for the Pell Grant program currently show that if we maintain the maximum grant amount that was raised during the stimulus and enrollment and eligibility remains as anticipated, there's a massive funding shortfall, $70 billion over the next 10 years. And so that just adds to the idea that it's going to be hard to find new money for innovative things in K-12. With that going on.
We continue with that commitment. Yeah. And yet at the same time, costs seem to escalate, and affordability is an issue. Joel, you mentioned earlier activity in the states, and there were a few dramatic things that happened in states. California approved a massive new financing commitment, which was surprising. Georgia and Washington approved new charter school measures. You alluded to Tony Bennett being ousted in Indiana. Are there other state developments, or what do you read into those, and what should we be looking for in state capitals as a result of this election?
You don't want to take a shot at that?
Well, I'll take a final shot at it. Let me take a final shot at it.
Yeah, I think sort of picking up on Celine's point about sort of consolidation, that one way to see what happens is this was a sort of status quo election at the federal level, right? We've got the Democrats still in charge of the Senate, Republicans in the House, Obama in the White House. And so we should expect basically a sort of continuation of the first term from the Obama administration. And so what that does is it sort of, they've put a bunch of sort of huge goals on the table. Common Core is one. These sort of district level race to the top, which asks districts to sort of do things with technology. So all of that essentially, since even in the most sort of strongest version of Democratic version of the federal role, the federal government is not going to provide this sort of support for all those things to happen. So all of that basically pushes all that work back to the states and the districts. And so the most sort of constructive version of what could happen is that states and districts could work to build the kind of teacher capacity, and or on the district side develop sort of, you know, districts of the future that would kind of fill in the big gap between the goals that have been set and where the practice sits today.
Okay, thank you.
On the state issue as well?
Please.
I think I'll put one issue on the table that well, I have a couple thoughts. One on the spending. So California did pass a spending measure that was specifically linked to education. Jerry Brown said, look, if you don't pass this tax increase on people earning more than $250,000, I'm going to cut education spending dramatically in the middle of the year. So it was linked, at least rhetorically. There were several, though, budget ballot items in other states that created new sources, or were intended to create new sources of revenue, whether it be a tobacco tax or a change to a corporate tax policy, that were specifically allocated for education. And they had a mixed record of success. I think went sort of 2 for 5. And I think the fact that states are having to resort to sort of these gimmicky approaches to funding education is just a sign of the fiscal pressure that remains the case at the state level. I think Jal correctly highlighted the fact that the charter school movement had a couple of big wins, and you don't want to overinterpret it, but those were yes votes in referenda where you generally have a bias towards the status quo. May suggest voters getting more comfortable with the idea. And then I think one important thing to point to was that the public sector unions in Michigan had attempted to get the Michigan Constitution amended such that it would protect collective bargaining rights formally in the Constitution. Essentially, this would take what Scott Walker did in Wisconsin, essentially eliminating collective bargaining rights off the table. And voters rejected that approach quite soundly. So I think that's another thing that is important to track.
Okay.
I want to just add one thing about Prop 30 in California, which did pass. Just in the vein of as California goes, so goes the nation. We work with teachers in Los Angeles, and they were very active, actually, in helping to get Prop 30 to pass. If it didn't end up passing, which made a tiny hike in the sales tax as well as added a tax to wealthy individuals, they would have lost in California 15 days of school this very school year, in addition to the 5 furlough days they had already had to take, for a total of 20 days less school this year. So school would have ended in early May, and that was very, very much kind of a definite to happen if they weren't able to raise this $6 billion in revenue. And so these fiscal pressures that states are facing, California kind of being a leading indicator, are just horrific. And what this means for teachers and the stability of their jobs, given that there's so much uncertainty about money, and that thousands of them are getting laid off each year and expected to hopefully return, but have no job security, is a really, really difficult thing to face.
I will use that as a segue to make a Beacon Hill comment since Jal invited me. Where we live is in the economic domain right now. Our budget is short of what the anticipated revenue would be even during this year, even when the economy is doing pretty well. And we're looking also ahead to next year's budget and still see a structural hole in that. There was hope of some revenue conversations once we got past the election, and speculation about whether or not it would be better to focus on specific programs that have an explicit kind of identity versus beefing up formulas that have been neglected over the past several years. So there's a lot of concern about that, against the background where, to Joel's point earlier, there's a feeling that probably not much will change in terms of policy coming from the federal government now. And at the same time, our field is overloaded, to Celine's earlier point. We're about implementation now, whether it's a Common Core state standards or thinking about the next step on assessment, or doing a better job by chronically underperforming schools, or doing a smart cap lift for charter schools, or implementing the teacher evaluation, which is just in the early stages. A lot of this is about implementation, and a lot of the politics of the policy development in those fields are playing out through the implementation phase. So I would say that our number one concern right now is economics, getting to a balanced budget, and trying to think about how we persuade taxpayers to make greater investments given the higher aspirations that are embodied in the Common Core standards and what we want to achieve. And then at the same time, not only implementing what's already on our plate, but doing a better job, for example, of connecting our employers to the work that's going on in secondary schools and community colleges. So some of these mid-skills jobs that are going unfilled in the Commonwealth have pipelines, so young people are being prepared and moving into those kinds of positions. So there's kind of an overwhelmed feeling in the sense that there's a great deal to do on the ground, but at the same time, we certainly don't want to slip back into the kind of budgetary situation that we were in 4 years ago. So we're paying close attention to that. Well, I want to open it up to the floor in a moment, but before we go to the audience, let me ask you one last question, which is, as you look ahead, and in light of the election, but just in a general way, what would you say is your single greatest hope and single greatest fear about the period of time going forward, particularly as regards federal education policy? John, you want to tackle that?
I mean, I think I started on this before, namely that my greatest hope is that there will be a period for some of these things to play out, and that sort of time will be used productively. I mean, today I was teaching, and we had Ben Levin from Ontario with us. Ben was the deputy minister in Ontario from 2003 to like 2008 or 9, and they had a sort of a long period where they invested in setting standards, building capacity, and very gradually sort of bumping up a couple of their indicators around reading and around high school graduations. And they created this kind of virtuous cycle around improvement leading to rising indicators, leading to going back to the public, asking for more money, saying, look, we made the progress we said we were going to make, et cetera. And so that's the kind of cycle that we want to see, especially as we're heading into a period of austerity where there are going to be really difficult choices to be made. I fear that it will be too easy to say there are big differences between what we are striving for and what we're accomplishing, so why should we put more money and support into that? So that would be my fear.
Okay, thank you. Celine?
I think one of the big picture things that the Obama administration and Secretary Duncan in particular have been advancing with respect to policy, but is the idea of building a performance-driven teaching profession that really puts the interests of students first and moves away from the seniority-driven model of the profession that has existed throughout history and time. And so I think that has been a really good thing. I think that has seen its share of challenges over the course of the past 4 years. And so, but for me, it's the right track. And so I'm excited about, presumably having the same secretary, which all word on the street seems to point to, and keeping that course.
Okay, thank you. Marty?
So I hope the Republican Party reforms its primary process. So I hope for actually, I do hope for a early reauthorization of ESEA that provides, I think, stability in the policy environment in American K-12 education to allow some of this to proceed. I think one of the concerns with the waiver approach is that these are 2-year waivers and no one knows what's coming next. I think more stability would be a good thing. And I'd prefer to see a compromise that is along the lines of what Governor Romney proposed, where the federal government requires much more in the way of transparency about school performance in exchange for being far less prescriptive. And I would not want to see, for example, requirements around teacher evaluation included, because I think that's an area where we know that we need to do a better job, but we don't know exactly how to do it. And I think it's going to be really hard for the federal government to write anything that leads to good outcomes. And I think that leads me to my greatest fear, which is that I hope Race to the Top implementation continues to go well. I worry that it may unravel, that the electoral outcomes from last night that Jal referred to earlier, that they might suggest something of a backlash against this new approach to the teaching profession that Celine wants to see emerge. And I worry that in 4 years, Americans will look around and say, oh, teacher evaluation, changes to compensation, we tried that and it didn't work. And let's just go back to the way things have always been. And I think that would be the worst possible outcome.
Okay. Well, thank you, panel, and you've been a patient audience, and I want to change gears now and ask members of the audience if you have questions to approach the respective microphones. We have one in each aisle. And if you don't mind, identify yourself and then raise a question, if you will. We're less looking for speeches than we are for questions on the topic. So I invite you to think of a question, and if it's directed to our particular panelist, please so direct it. Yes, sir.
Doesn't sound like it.
If you keep talking, it'll probably go on.
Okay. Oh, there we go. My name is Daniel Velasco, and I'm Ed School alumni, and I currently run the Diplomas Now initiative in Boston, which is the school turnaround in a couple of Boston public schools. My question is around SIG grant money. So we've been inputting SIG money into these turnaround schools that are very high need across the country for several years now. However, SIG money runs out. And what SIG money has done is sort of build a foundation at the schools, right? Like we've given the schools a lot more resources than they used to have to hire more teachers, coaches, get better curriculum, develop their own curriculum, et cetera, bring partners and whatnot, like Diplomas Now. So my question is, what happens once that SIG money is gone? Because there doesn't seem to be another sort of source of funding for the schools to maintain the same rigor of need of programming.
Great question. Thank you. Anybody want to tackle that? These are the school improvement grants that go to chronically underperforming schools to help them generate a variety of turnaround activities.
Yeah, we run a program that takes teams of 25% of a school faculty, all experienced teachers who have a track record of effectiveness in urban systems, and works with them to be teacher leaders within a turnaround school. And so that program is funded in large part, particularly the teacher stipends for that program are funded in large part by SIG funds. Frankly, I think this is a problem. I think that the way that the funding is distributed in a kind of 3 years and then goodbye is really problematic, because the reality of the programs like the one that we run and probably the one that you run is you actually could kind of over time kind of decrease the how much investment we as an organization make, how much need there is for kind of really robust teacher leadership versus maybe less than 25% of the school being paid to be formal leaders. And so this has been a problem. We're working with some of the schools that we started with 3 years ago to do independent fundraising at this point. They recognize that they can scale down what they're doing, and we agree with them on that. But there really is a need for something that's less dramatic than 3 years all in and then 100% out.
Talk about cliffs. A number of these schools who've really jacked up performance and built capacity dramatically are suddenly facing this cliff. Joe?
Just one small thing. The person I talked to in the department, who is reasonably well place to make decisions about these things. I mean, it's clear the department still cares a lot about school improvement and plans to try to work on kind of spreading knowledge, taking the best things and sort of using their sort of knowledge dissemination function. But where the money is going to come from is anybody's guess.
The only thing I'd like to say on that is that I hope the answer to your question is informed in part by the results of the School Improvement Grant Program, which were supposed to have been released actually some time ago and haven't emerged, and I have no idea why that's the case. But I think those results will actually have broader implications than just for the School Improvement Grant Program. So one of the debates in the ESEA reauthorization debate is, should the federal government actually prescribe that you restructure persistently underperforming schools? And I think there's a consensus that you want to make any prescriptions much more focused on, say, the bottom 5%, the bottom 10%, rather than as broad as they were under No Child Left Behind. But if the school improvement grant results don't look good, then you may actually see much more momentum towards the idea that, gosh, this work is really, the federal government is really poorly positioned to do that work.
It does also, I think, get into this underlying argument: are we going to have to differentiate in terms of the way in which we finance some schools dealing with greater challenges or greater achievement gaps than others? And is this just something that you can do in a one-off, short-term investment where they build capacity and then you can withdraw it? Or are there really elements of capacity that are introduced in those schools under these kinds of circumstances that are just need to be permanent if these schools are expected to perform at the level of other schools? It does raise that question as we figure on policy there.
Just
Thank you.
Real quick on the evaluation question. The only problem with sort of linking it too tightly to sort of the evaluations writ large is there's going to be a lot of variation in implementation. And so almost any study of that sort is going to find, there are some really good programs over here and not so good programs over there. And so we could sort of base it all on the mean. And we could say if the mean is greater, we should sort of continue to invest in this. Or we could say, we learned some things from the, the folks on the right end of the distribution. And then the question is sort of how would you invest more in that without being overly prescriptive from too far away? And that's just a sort of ongoing conundrum of ed policy in general.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next question, please.
Hi, my name is Megan Dowdle. I'm an ed school alum as well from Danny's year, and I work in Lawrence, Massachusetts right now for the community group. And we're a nonprofit that manages early childhood centers and also 3 charter schools. And we were asked by Jeff Riley to come in and manage one of the public schools, their kindergarten and first grade. With our charter model, we have a 4-year-old program. And one of the things that we're battling right now is wishing that we had a 3 or 4-year-old program at the public school that we were working with. So I was just wondering if one or all of you could talk about what you think the future of early childhood education is in the next 4 years and what they will prioritize.
Good. Thank you for the question. I've got some thoughts about that, but let me turn to the panel first.
You're probably best positioned to answer this one.
Well, I mean, if we look over the landscape, and if you were to ask me in my term in government here, and I've got responsibility over early childhood, K through 12, and higher education, and we've worked hard to keep pace and to prioritize education generally in those categories, and we've done, I think, a great job in K-12. We've done less well in higher education, particularly in face of escalating costs. And in early childhood education, though we've attempted to hold the line on issues of access and access policies, our actual investment has been going down, notwithstanding the compelling research that regularly points our attention to, if we want to make a highly leveraged investment and we want to make a difference long-term in communities like Lawrence, we're going to have to beef up our investment there. So I think it's the most highly leveraged investment we can make in the future of public education, and it starts beforehand. And yet we're not in a position to do that now. 95% of what we spend in early childhood education at the state level now comes from the federal government, and we're up against the sorts of limitations that we've discussed in the larger picture here. We were proud in Massachusetts to win the race to the top grant in early childhood, the Early Learning Challenge grant, as well as the race to the top grant in K-12. But that's only gotten us so far. So I don't see in our budget immediately, as we cope with the problems that we're facing right now, a deeper investment. But there's a lot of attention focused on it. We now have a goal that's broadly accepted, articulated by the governor, supported by the legislature. We have now a special commission to get to proficiency in literacy by grade 3. All students reading at proficient. We're a long way from there right now. We can't do that without investing more deeply in early childhood. We can't do it with a focus on first and second grade. We're going to have to go to the 3- and 4-year-olds. So I think I'm optimistic over the long term that all the evidence suggests we ought to move in that direction. In the near term, I'm not optimistic that we're going to have sufficient resources to do that unless we go back to taxpayers and ask for more revenues more broadly.
At the federal level, I mean, I think the Obama administration was sort of faced with a conundrum, which was there are these really positive evaluations on these kind of star pilot programs, Perry Preschool, Abecedarian Project, et cetera, which show huge, huge payoffs down the road. That's when you see people say like $1 in early childhood is $10 down the road. But then the evaluations of Head Start and the broader things were much more mixed. And so the early childhood challenge grants are sort of a way to try to respond to that and to try to kind of incentivize more good practice. And from everything that I hear, it sounds like they're going to kind of continue with that approach at the federal level.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. We have another question.
Hi, I'm Jeremiah Newell, Cohort 3 of EDLD. My question is around the role of the U.S. Department of Education over time. So with the increased decentralization and polarization and loss of resources, how do you see the role of the U.S. Department changing or needing to change to better support the kind of potentially transformational outcomes that we might see the sector needing right now?
Anybody?
Well, I'll say I think there's been a move for a while that has continued to try to move the federal bureaucracy as well as state bureaucracies more away from kind of the compliance orientation that they've been into to more of a support role. But that has been a challenge, I think, at all levels of the system. You know, state agencies as well as the federal government. The federal government is quite far away, and the federal government is quite far away, and the state agencies, you know, suffer from a lack of capacity and some needs to kind of respond to the federal bureaucracy. And so this move, or this attempted move from compliance to support, and more of a focus on kind of outcomes and accountability with more looseness in how do you get there, is, I think, the direction we've been moving in, but we're not nearly there, and I anticipate that Marty will say we should go much further.
I think those are all encouraging developments. One thought in response to your question is that, you know, when it comes to authority in American public education, for the federal government to have any, it hinges on it spending. And so to the extent that federal spending on education were to atrophy to, you know, historically it's been between 7 and 10% of total public education spending. And you know, people always say, how can it have such a large role given that it spends that little? Well, you know, most people don't want to lose 7 to 10% of their spending. But you know, at some point, it probably becomes too little to actually, you know, have much of a role at all. So I think that's one, and Congress wants to have a role, and frankly, the American public wants the federal government to be involved in education, and so I think there is going to be pressure to, you know, maintain some investment over time. And you know, my view, in more generally, is that exactly along the lines that Celine is saying, that the federal government should restrict its role to what it's best positioned to do, which is to provide transparency about performance throughout the system. And I'd like to see it continue to encourage the expansion of forms of school choice and the emergence of the types of actors that Jal had talked about earlier. But
Marty, do you think there's any possibility that in a future election, Republicans could essentially, that the presidential candidate on the Republican side could make a stronger argument for a much weaker federal role? that essentially like up through 96, the Democrats embraced some federal role, and in the Republican Party platform was calling for the abolition of the Department of Ed. And then because Bush had been a governor, he ran on education issues, No Child Left Behind was his thing, he brought along a good portion of the Republican Party. And then this time it was Romney running, who similarly had a governor's record to run on, and thus again sort of took a middle of the road position. But what if someone, on the Republican side didn't come with a governor's background, came from the House or the Senate, and took more, because you could see that the Bush period is sort of the outlier on the Republican side, or you could see it as we've just like from basically like the national educational goals in '89 forward, we haven't seen much in the way of increased spending in the like larger scheme of things, but we have seen an increased federal role over the last 25 years or so. And so, I don't know, any thoughts on that?
I think you're asking a question about the future of the Republican Party to some degree, and which direction it takes, and I think what will be a big internal debate over the next few months or years. But frankly, the Republican Party changed its position on the role of the Department of Education and the role of the federal government more generally because they had a losing hand. And that's what they learned in 96 and 92, and George W. Bush showed them how they could actually change their perception on that issue, and that played a big role in his election. So despite the pressures that are put on Republican candidates in the primaries, and I was hoping every Republican debate that I would get through it without Romney eliminating the Department of Education. Both because I think it was a bad idea and I think it would hurt him in the general election. I think the party knows that the American public thinks that education is too important of an issue for national economic competitiveness, is the way the public thinks about it, for the federal government not to be involved.
I'd say from my standpoint as a state education official, a hope that I have and a way in which I think the federal government can have an impact without a huge amount of spending is through a combination of small incentives, such as Race to the Top. Even though it's a substantial amount of money, it's a small amount of money overall in terms of what we're spending, and or just utilization of the bully pulpit to cause us to stretch some of our thinking, to cause us in areas where we need help, where the federal government could play a leadership role. For example, the utilization of technology for the delivery of instruction in elementary and secondary education, which I think offers great promise in terms of helping us break down the boundaries of time and space that limit us in terms of our capacity to utilize simply the mechanism of schooling to close achievement gaps and create an equality of opportunity. So I think there's some room there on the early childhood topic that was raised before. On this question of how do we tie, for example, social services, I would rather have had a conception of Race to the Top, which we had earlier, that was broader in terms of our capacity to bring in social and human services as part of the solution to chronic achievement gaps where we find them, since we know they correlate with poverty. I would rather have seen more openness to collaboration with higher education and early childhood in addition. So causing us to stretch our conception of what a 21st century education system looks like if we're going to ask a 21st century education to realize our ideals of getting all of our children to a level of proficiency that's not only a moral obligation, but something that's in our economic self-interest to do right now. Other questions or comments? Surely we don't have an HGSE group speechless on such an important topic. Please.
Hi, my name's Lydia Ross. I'm a current student in the Arts and Education program, and I was hoping that you could speak either on a state level or a federal level to what we might see in the future of arts in schools policies, either, say, the continuation of the Turnaround Arts Initiative on the federal level, or maybe more creative solutions to how the arts can continue to play a role in schools.
I mean, it's been an unfortunate period for the arts for a long period of time, which I don't need to tell you. When Obama ran in 2008, he talked about, schools being places where kids did more than bubble tests, and he talked rather eloquently about the sort of range of functions that schools should fulfill, which presumably would include the arts. But his policies, many of which I think have been sensible, the emphasis on teacher evaluation systems tied to test scores continue to push things down the same road that they've been going. So as long as that continues, it will be hard to get the arts to this sort of the center of the kind of funding, on the mainstream funding conversation agenda. The only other hope I see potentially is this whole kind of 21st century skills, next generation of, what are we going to need kids to be able to do in the future as to be kind of productive citizens, presumably things like creativity, originality. When I visit schools, often I'm looking for classes in which students are being challenged, in which they're being given opportunities to craft original work. If you look at things like Bloom's taxonomy, recall and understanding are at the bottom and apply, synthesize, and create are at the top. And it's often in arts classes where students are really doing that kind of work. And arts teachers are often hesitant to speak to me as an outside visitor, hesitant to speak to the school as if they really have something to offer. But in terms of the modes of instruction they're using, if part of what we're looking for in the future is a kind of a future in which kids are sort of regurgitating less and sort of doing and creating more, the arts have things to offer, not only in and of themselves, but to the mainstream. It's often like, should we fund the arts because they increased math scores? And I might argue that we have real standards in arts, and particularly in music, as to what good work looks like. And if we could think about standards in those kind of original meaning of the word standards, that kind of thing could infuse us more broadly. It'd be a good thing.
I think from a state level, what I'd say is we feel increasing pressure from people in the arts communities as they can increasingly document the degree to which the arts have become marginalized in current school systems. That's a consequence of our elevating the importance of core subjects which we measure. That which we measure becomes important. And we intended that. That was part of the purpose of education reform and driving competency and core skills. The flaw in the paradigm is we have a fixed time paradigm. We're asking schools to do something that they've never done before, which is to educate all, not just some of our students, to a high level. That takes more time than it used to take to just educate a few to a high level, but we haven't increased the amount of time we have available. So the result is things like the arts get driven to the margin or driven out, and we can see it and we can feel it, and we continue yet to ask schools to give us well-rounded students who have 21st century skills and have world-class skills in English and math and science and so forth, and it doesn't fit in the old box that we have, which is why I think this more expansive definition of what education is and the utilization of technology and the federal government helping us push the boundaries where we move beyond simply seeing the closing of achievement gaps is about optimizing schooling, but it's about a child's whole life and how we integrate the rest of their lives into learning, into child development now. I think we've got to work harder on it, and I think we're increasingly being pushed up against those boundaries, and I hope we'll find a way to grapple with them in the next few years.
Thank you.
Okay.
So in the words of one Republican strategist, we have a Latino problem, which may be indicative in itself. But I'm curious what this election and the result of this election and the Republican soul searching might have on bilingual education and the DREAM Act in particular, and what your thoughts are.
Let's throw in-state tuition in there, if any of you have any comments on that, please.
I think, so as I said, I'm skeptical of my ability to anticipate the future, but obviously there's a lot of consternation within the Republican Party right now about their traditional position on some of these issues, and there is a diversity of opinion on, especially when it comes to the DREAM Act in-state tuition. The fact that you had someone like Rick Perry, who was a quite conservative governor in a state like Texas, and he was out there trying to defend that idea, shows you that there is diversity in the Republican Party on the positions on this issue. And so I think I can only imagine that you'd see movement in that direction. On bilingual education, I actually don't know what to say because there's actually a lot of diversity of opinion within the Latino community about the proper approach and what the goals of programs for English language learners should be. So while I think you should certainly anticipate Republican movement towards more flexibility when it comes to immigration policies and education policies related to them, I don't have a strong sense on the other sort of broader topic.
I'll just say two things real quickly. It's not my area of expertise. Number one is in Maryland, they did pass a state level version of the DREAM Act. And number two is a lot of the post-mortem that I've heard and the kind of implications for education are all kind of situated in the context, the broader context of both the fiscal cliff, which we talked about a lot, and immigration reform. And so, I think the question on the table would be, is the Obama administration going to take up a broader immigration reform initiative? And then if so, how do some of these education issues fall out in that?
That introduces sort of a more general political question here, and I'm wondering if you think the administration has incurred any significant political debts that will have to be repaid over the next 4 years, or looked at as if you look at the course of the election and you look at the course of some of the kinds of things that we've laid out that the administration would continue to like to accomplish, who would you expect to be their obvious allies and opponents as they go forward? Joe?
On which issues?
Well, for example, the teacher evaluation issue, to take one, or on reauthorization. I mean, do you see any new dynamics emerging as a consequence of the campaign and the election that weren't already there, or do you see things pretty much settling into the same camps as we had before the election?
I mean, it seems like the most interesting dynamic that could potentially be new is what the Republicans decide to do in general about whether they want to stick to their principles or whether they think that the better path forward for them is to sort of look for some form of compromise in the middle. The people that I've heard in the last couple of days have said, both on education and more generally, that they're open to compromise. There are sort of possibilities around the mainstream issues, and notably, I'm sure a number of you were still up at 1:20 in the morning when the president went on with his acceptance speech. He also did not highlight a sort of highly partisan agenda and picked up on things like debt relief, immigration reform, et cetera. So I think a lot just depends on the Republicans, whether the way that they read this election, in part with respect to Latinos, but more generally with respect to sort of what their role should be in divided government. How they make decisions about that is essentially what's going to determine what's going to happen in the next 4 years, because Obama certainly doesn't have a stronger hand. He won election, which will enable him to continue the things which he has already put into place. That it sort of cements the things that have been accomplished in the first term, but that doesn't sort of create necessary space for the second term.
Marty, if you could engineer that Republican posture or approach going forward, learning the lessons of this campaign, where would you position the party?
Well, on education or more broadly?
No, on education.
On education, I think, as I've said, they can't walk away from any federal involvement whatsoever. So when it comes to federal elections, that they need to have a coherent vision of the federal role. And I think I like to think that Governor Romney made some progress in that direction, but clearly we could do a better job. I think one of the reasons why education didn't come up much in the election is because on many of the most sort of contentious education policy debates, the candidates agreed. So on charter schools, on teacher evaluation, on things like that. Their disagreements were much more subtle, but they were mainly about issues of federalism.
Right.
And
Technical
so
in nature.
I'd like to see the Republican Party develop an ability to put forward a coherent set of ideas in that space that would be compelling. I don't know whether that's possible. One thing I was told is that new ideas are never a good idea in the context of a presidential election, and so that work needs to be going on now and sort of going on at the state level.
Socialize from there. Yep.
Okay, we have, before I ask the panel, one last question. We have time for one last question if anybody has a burning question that
There
they'd
was
like to-
someone over here.
Okay, Sarah?
I'm Sarah. I'm a graduate student here at GSE. I'm wondering about a national test. So I see the Common Core, and obviously states are opting in, and then we have this the two testing consortia, I guess. And I'm wondering with this, the federal, what Obama is trying to do, walking a fine line between, what the federal role is and taking credit for some of it but not for others. What is the maybe potential for a national test to be in our future? I know you don't like to predict the future, Marty.
Yeah. So I think it is unlikely as the sort of pushback to the Common Core as we're seeing right now, and there are still more red states than blue states, and that means that there are plenty of opportunities for Republicans to get in the way in the Senate and other places. Secretary Page, George W. Bush's first Secretary of Education, he actually had this idea that he played with for a while, and I don't think it ever got put forward publicly, but he wanted to create a national test that was available for any parent to give to their child at home. They could print it off from the internet and administer it under, I guess they would specify some conditions and would allow everyone to know where they're going. I don't know if that type of approach could ever get off the ground. I do think that Republicans could come around to the idea that the federal government's role is to provide transparency about outcomes. I don't think they could get behind a national test just because of the history of the American role on education, but I think they could come around to the idea that we'll use various means of equating to NAEP or things like that to sort of put their stamp of approval on what states are telling parents about the level of achievement.
I agree with Marty that the possibility of an actual national test that the federal government gets behind is highly unlikely. But I do think one of the things to watch over the next few years are how states migrate between the Smarter Balance Consortium and the PARC Consortium. The best information I have from working in states that are affiliated with both consortia is that the progress of Smarter Balanced is much more complicated, and it could very well be the case, and this again is way too far into predicting the future, that one consortium falls apart, the other grows stronger, and ends up getting adopted by many of the places that have implemented the Common Core. So I could envision that trajectory more likely than I could envision the opposite, the federal government saying all 50 states. It just doesn't strike me as in line with the way that the history of the nation has gone.
Okay, thank you. Panelists, I want to ask you if there's anything I haven't asked you that you'd like to comment about, or any final thoughts that you want to leave the audience with about your perception of where we're headed.
The only thing I would add is that the person I talked to in the department said that we should expect to see more attention around things like promised neighborhoods, cross-agency collaboration, and sort of money around kind of integrated anti-poverty school programs, to which I said, where has that, there was money for promised neighborhoods, but not that much, and what makes you think you can do it now and not before, and so on. But they seemed pretty eager to do it. So that would be my one sort of, surprising prediction if it were to happen, because from the outside I wouldn't have expected that. In general, in conversations, the department folks continue to outline a rather ambitious agenda on all of these fronts: early childhood, higher ed, Common Core, Race to the Top, I3. They want to keep moving forward on all of those things and talk about them with some confidence. Whereas the whereas Congress is increasingly skeptical of the department doing things sort of unilaterally, and so it'll be really interesting to see how that tension plays out.
The only thing I think, I guess I'd like to say, and it ends something with a statement of hope. Education's one of those issues in American politics where actually there is legitimate hope for bipartisan sort of collaboration. And my hope actually was that the Obama administration in its first term would have turned to education reform first, because I actually think he could have carved out a reauthorization of No Child Left Behind at that point and actually had it be a big victory for his administration rather than healthcare, which turned out to be much more divisive, obviously, but obviously an important accomplishment for his party. So my hope is that they will need a win in terms of bipartisanship, that they'll actually want to go in that direction, and that education will be an opportunity for them to do so.
I just got to say this. I almost sat here and listened to you go past that obviously. The divisive obviously really called for, because the divisiveness around health, the healthcare initiative was so much on both sides. And someone needs to talk about the congressional opposition that he fought, that he had to address on every single point, every single initiative going forward for the past 4 years. We talked a little bit earlier about how slow education grew over the last 4 years compared to the Bush administration and to the Clinton administration. Those were 2 8-year administrations as opposed to the last 4. This is the kind of sort of, again, bubble that, as far as I'm concerned, the Romney administration and the Tea Party has been engaged in for at least the past 2 years.
Let me respond. Okay. I apologize if I was insufficiently clear. On the spending point, I was talking about annual rates of growth, so it doesn't matter whether we're talking about 4 years or 8 years.
But you didn't clarify that. And you've been talking about...
No, I'm sorry. And I actually don't think, I wasn't trying to praise Obama or not. No, or criticize him for that, rather. And on healthcare, I was talking about the choice of issue that turned out to be decisive. And I was acknowledging that you can see it as an accomplishment that was worth the division, but it also turned out to be, I thought there were more prospects for bipartisan collaboration on education than on healthcare. So I actually was trying to remain quite neutral about that rather than talk about a strategic decision.
Okay, criticism received, and can we hold this till afterwards? I appreciate it. Fair point, and the panelists will be here afterwards to follow up on it. Any other final comments from panelists?
I'll make a quick final comment looking into the future, and that is, we haven't talked about tonight the role of unions. The role of unions, arguably, given the fact we haven't talked about it, has diminished over time, but Obama did win a whole bunch of important swing states with the support of unions. If you look at Chicago, the unions aren't dead, but they are dealing with a profound demographic shift. More than half of teachers now have less than 10 years experience. First time that's been the case since the early 70s. And so that question is a question that has massive national implications and not necessarily federal, but across the country.
I'd only say from my perspective, last comment from a state role, we're careful not to hold our breath for the federal government to act and point the direction in which we should move. At the same time, we're deeply appreciative of federal leadership, of the utilization of that bully pulpit, of incentives that the federal government provides and support that they can provide. We are now about coping with the financial imperatives and realities that we're facing and digging deeper into the work that has been set on course over the past half dozen years, and we look forward to a federal partnership in doing that work as we go ahead. We've exhausted our time. I want to ask you to join me in thanking our panel for a thoughtful discussion.